Bob Anderson, United States Army, Vietnam. I interviewed Bob in Omaha, Nebraska. It was January 14, 2006. Quite a few years ago, folks. He told me a great story about Vietnam. He served in the infantry, 68 and 69 in Vietnam, C Company of the 5th Division. And Bob was one of the first Vietnam veterans that I interviewed for my work. He's featured in my film, Vietnam Remembered. If you haven't watched that, you need to watch it. It's my most watched video on my YouTube channel. I'd like to thank Brandon Glidden. God bless you, brother. Thank you for allowing people to hear and to see Bob's story today. And just thank you for your commitment, continued commitment, Brandon, to my work in our country. So if you'd like to sponsor one of these videos, folks, please, I encourage you to check out the information in the video description below this video and in the comment section. You can go to my website, LarryCapetto.com, click on Sponsor a Vet, and it'd be great to hear from you. I really encourage you to do it, folks. You know, these stories are just, they're like a fine wine. The older they get, the more valuable they become. And I'm just so grateful. I thank God for this work in the last 20 years, interviewing over 1,000 veterans across North America and parts of the world. And I'm happy to bring you Bob's story today. So Vietnam Remembered. And if you'd like to share these videos, that'd be great. Subscribe to this channel. Let's keep it going. Let's get the word out there. We're living in a day where we need to hear these stories, folks. History is best learned from those who are there. God bless you. Just very little notes about you, and I just want to, we're going to talk about a lot of things. We have about 45 minutes, and okay. Just tell me, you're with the Army. Mm-hmm. Give me company, division, regiment, all that, who you were with in Vietnam.
Oh, Vietnam? Yeah. Well, first, Westmoreland didn't want the 5th Division, and so they said they needed more troops, and so they started up the 5th Division, and that was in Colorado. And so they picked certain people to go to the 5th Division, which was, once you got there, you were in a frozen unit. You had no choice. You were going to go to Vietnam with that unit. So, but we had the opportunity to work with every individual at that time that you were going to be with prior to getting to Vietnam. And so that's what I was in C Company, 1st of the 61st, that went to Vietnam in the very first flow. And then they were going to send the whole division over later. But then I'd say probably half of it got there, and then they stopped the rest of it coming over.
So what was your title, your MOS?
I was in the infantry,
okay.
Non-commissioned officer.
Okay, and your rank at the time?
I was a sergeant.
Okay. So you tell me the years you were in again.
68 and 6. Well, I went in 67,
okay.
And got out in 69. Okay. But in Vietnam, I was there in 68 and 69.
So was that one tour, 2 tours?
One tour.
Okay, which is 12 months. 12 months?
Right, 12 months standard is what it is when you go to Vietnam.
Okay. Tell me about going to Vietnam. You trained. You went to Vietnam. You got there. What maybe struck you when you got to Vietnam? Sights, smells, sounds, tell me a little bit about it, just when you arrived.
We arrived at night, and probably when we got there, it wasn't an hour, and everything broke loose. We came into Da Nang, and at that time, we landed on a flight line, and they had some big steel girder berms set up around, and we went in behind them, and they had some lights because it was at night and they didn't want people to be able to see too well. And so we unloaded, and like I said, we went as a complete unit, not as an individual that's going to meet up with a unit there. We went as a complete unit. So I had my full squad that was with me, and so we went behind the berm. And once we got behind the berm, they says, okay, well, this is a staging area. What we're going to do is we're going to wait for another plane to come in. So that plane took off real quick. Well, within probably about 15 minutes, some planes started to land on the PSP runway. And That was fine. You know, you hear the propellers roaring, so they sit there and yell at you, get. The tail dropped down. All you saw was red light inside because they didn't want it real bright. They're shoving you on the back of this airplane. Well, about the time that I got on the back of the airplane, we're all being herded on like cattle. In the middle of the dark, you can't hardly see. So you get on this plane. They didn't even get the tailgate off the ground by about, probably about a foot and a half. And the plane's rolling. It's moving down, getting ready to take off. And all of a sudden, rounds started coming in, hitting the PSP. They're trying to attack and hit the airplanes. And we took off from there. And they did some damage on the runway, and they had to do some fast repair to get the rest of them out. They sent us, at that time, we didn't know where we were going at all. We had no clue. But they took us further north, from Da Nang up to the Quang Tri area up on the DMZ. We landed, got off the plane. Again, they pushed you off the plane and took off. And we're standing out there, can't see. It was pitch black. Nobody's got a light. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, someone just, here, this way. So you're trying to find what direction that this voice is coming from. And they're telling everybody to grab hands. And he grabs somebody, and we're supposed to go in the dark over to this building. We couldn't see the building. It was just that black. And so they turned off the lights inside the building. They got us inside the door, shut the door, and then turned on the lights. That was our initiation to Vietnam.
You're a sergeant at that time?
Right, I was a sergeant. Before I left the States, I was a sergeant.
You ever been in combat before?
I was in combat. Okay. I was with the 5th Division. That was actually, the 5th Division was mechanized also. You know, we had the capabilities, we had our own tracks. But during the monsoon, you park your track and you're off on the foot. So you're both infantry and track mech unit is what we were. But we had everything we had our own helicopters, we had our own tank unit and everything in the 5th Division. So we were a complete unit, the 5th.
Tell me about some of the involvement with the helicopters, what your role was, what you were doing, where you were, and what was going on.
Being in the infantry, once you leave your track, we had to have the way of getting from location to location, mission to mission. And we could either walk in, or they would fly you in, get an eagle flight, what we called an eagle flight. They would call in, get the helicopters together. We'd load onto the helicopters and then go from there out to the location that we needed to be, and then went from that point on to get where we had to be. They would never try to drop you right in on the enemy. They always tried to get you to a staging area that you could walk from then in for the surprisal. When I was wounded, what had happened, we had an arc light, and an arc light was a B-52 strike that they come in and do saturated bombings. And we were at that particular time on a stand down, and we were up at a base camp called C3, cleaning our weapons and our gear and everything. We'd been out, and it had been a month before we could do a stand down. So my men were all cleaning their gear and everything. We listened to the arc light, and one of the kids in my squad said, "Well, what's that?" And I said, "Well, that's an arc light." He said, "Well, what's an arc light?" I said, "That's a B-52 strike." So all of a sudden we heard this, load up, and it was the platoon sergeant at the time telling us that we're going to be moving out into that area. And I thought that was crazy. We can't move out into that area, not after an immediate arc light. And I says, "We can't." He says, "Load up." I says, "We can't. Someone needs to get a hold of the Air Force." I said, "What happens here is you've got your delayed bombs. They'll do an aerial burst. They'll do a point detonating, and then they do a delayed burst. And they can set the bomb so it delays, it'll penetrate the ground. And the enemy will come in and think at that particular time it's over with. This could be 2 or 3 hours later. Well, they get back into the area thinking they're safe, and then the bombs blow up. So now you've got them. So they checked with the Air Force, and that's exactly what they did. They used some delayed bombs. So we couldn't move in until the next day. Well, our helicopters at that particular time were tied up. They were already out on another mission with some of the other companies. So they called into the 3rd Marine Division to get the 3rd Marines to get their Chinooks and take us in. So what we were going to do is go in on a battalion-type operation, do cloverleafs. And a cloverleaf is where you take in, go into one location, you hold that position, and bring in another company into it, or bring a platoon in. And you actually work into a clover leaf. One unit will go west, one east, one north, one south, and you just make a big loop to check out the area. Well, when you're checking out the area, you're just trying to see how many body count there might be, logistics, see what the damage was, to assess it, to see how well it worked for them. Well, it was all fine and dandy, but in this particular case, the pilots of the helicopter took us in off course. So we went into a total virgin area, not knowing it until we touched up onto the mountaintop, or a hilltop. And my particular platoon at the time was spearhead going in. And we were losing people because the wind was high. They nosed into the hilltop. So the back of the Chinook was raising and lowering, and that sometimes it'd be 30 feet off the ground. Well, we were fully loaded with our packs and gear, jumping off of that thing, and it raised up 30 feet. Now you're hitting the ground, and people were breaking their legs, ankles, and everything. Had to be a medevac out of there immediately. So we started setting up our perimeter at that particular time. And it was a hot LZ, is what it was, a landing zone. And so we were trying to give protection while the rest of the people were coming in so that they could get off that hilltop so that they could get into cover. And so at that particular time, I took off and took one sector. And it wasn't long after we got it set up, they were constantly bringing people in. And we were getting entrenched in for the night because we knew our unit was going to hold that hilltop until the next day before we moved off. But it was so intense at the time, I had a rocket round come about 6 to 8 feet in front of me, landed across the front of our unit, landed in front of me and wounded me in my right arm and burnt my chest. The blast was so close to me. And at that time I couldn't hear. But I was checking my men, and I was sitting there now, because I was completely on the ground. It had me knocked down. And somebody grabbed me, and they grabbed my weapon, and I didn't want somebody to take my weapon. Well, they had my weapon, but part of the shrapnel from the round from the rocket was sticking out of the back of my arm, on my right arm. So I couldn't hear because I was so close to the explosion, and it was a while before I could totally see. Then what happened then was they got me up to the medevac, and they tried to pull the shrapnel out because it was still sticking out of the arm. And at that time they had to make some assessments. Well, are they going to medevac me out or keep me there with my unit? Well, one person was yelling, no, he'll be fine, he'll be fine, he'll be fine. And the CO didn't know about it. And finally, when the CO found out about it, he says he won't be able to use that arm tomorrow. So they decided to call a medevac. Well, up to this point, a lot of time has gone by. We had so much enemy fire on our location that they brought in the jets, they brought in the Cobras and the Hueys. And we had people just dropping down into the valley or the rice paddies down below. They were moving off our hill. They were just being zeroed in because we were in a total virgin area. I was the last medevac off our hill and went on in to the 3rd Marine Division to be operated on. At that particular time, though, what had happened was they stopped all air support. That means now, not even the jets could come in. They took off all the Cobras, all the Hueys, and no jet support. So we were supposed to dig in and hang on. I had a semi-operation on my arm at the 3rd Marine Division's hospital. And they sent me over to another rear area at that time. And so I got a hold of a radio so I could listen to the people in my squad that was still out on that operation. And so that night, at the other side of that hilltop from my position, the platoon that was on the other side, the enemy came up and over it and overran that position and took out all but one from that platoon. So they were stuck at that particular time. And so we're sitting there, you know, everybody from the rear area was trying to see what was going on. So we were listening to the radio. So this went on for days because now it was so bad in that particular area that they could not get out with the helicopters to bring the wounded bodies out. So now it's up to our unit and who's left alive to march out to a safe area, but you had to take them, put these bodies in body bags and bring them out with you. Well, when you're dealing with 120, 130 degrees during the day and you try to eat and you're carrying those bags with you, it's not fun. The stench just is there, but you couldn't leave the bodies. We had to get them back. And that's basically what happened on that particular mission, and I went on and I had 2 other operations. And,
so the Chinooks are what transported you? Did you
in this particular case, it was a Chinook that took us in on the location because they could put more men on that type of a helicopter. But normally what we used was just a Huey, and you could jump in and out of both sides and get in quick. They didn't even have to land. You could jump out, you could rappel out or whatever. So normally with my unit, we usually use the Hueys. But in this particular case, what we had to use was the Marines helicopters, and we went in big, big waves. And you can get a lot of people on the back of a Chinook. You know, and it's got a big tailgate, drops down, and it doesn't have to land, like I said. So, you know, we were getting wounded trying to jump off the thing because of the wind coming up the side of the hill. It would make the back of the helicopter raise and lower. So hopefully when you jumped, you were about a foot off the ground instead of about 20 feet that it could raise up.
What kind of weapon do you have?
M16.
And you're a sergeant over a platoon, a squad?
I was a squad leader.
So you've got infantrymen?
Right, we were all infantry.
So were there situations where, as you continued your tour, where you did use the Huey and you did go into a hot LZ, or are they all pretty much secured?
After I was wounded, that knocked me down to the point where I didn't go out on a lot of missions after that one. Like I said, I had a couple other operations, had to go to the 6th Convalescent Center. I did not leave country. Some people, when they were wounded, they left country. They'd go maybe even to Guam. They might go to Japan, or come all the way back to the States. I was wounded, then went back to my unit. But then when I got back to my unit, what had happened was they took and put me in the rear area, and I was in charge, or not in charge, but I worked at the repo depot. They put me there because being a non-commissioned officer and going to school for it, I could be an instructor. I had an instructor status. So the new recruits coming over from the States now, you had to go through block of instructions on just about everything prior to going out to a unit. So if this one unit lost X amount of men, they had to be replaced. Well, when they got there, they met us first, went through the block of instructions, and then shipped out to a unit, is what it was. So we still used the Hueys. Your Hueys up in our area were used to get you to the location, and we used the Hueys an awful lot for the medevacs up there. Marines used the bigger helicopters more so than what we did.
So as far as the medevacs, I mean, you're out in the jungle, you're out fighting, and then at what point do they call in helicopters? I mean, radio communication saying we need. I mean, the Huey is a workhorse. I mean, I realize it went in and out, but is that kind of how it happens? Is that call it in and there's a pilot and a gunner maybe, and you?
They'd have a pilot and a gunner, and somebody has to report that they need to get the medevac in. And so somebody will call in, get a hold of the medevac, they'll get your location, they come to get the bodies out and bring recruits in. And resupply can also come in on that same wave. But they will have a gunner to try to help protect them as they're coming in and out. And he'll load from either side. And in some cases they can't touch down. And they'll just get as close to the ground as possible. And you have to, people are loading them on. And either he's dead or he's alive. You know, they try to get the live ones out immediately so that they can have a chance to live. You know, and it's amazing what these guys can take and do in that particular case. But every person in the military is taught field expediency on first aid anyway. So, you know, when a man goes down, you hopefully that you can help him until a medic gets to him. And then you can get a medevac to come in. But if, like in my case, I was the last medevac going out because there was just too much firepower there. When I was on that hilltop, what that was, the logistics came back. And that was a full battalion of North MVA troops coming down across the DMZ, infiltrating into the south is what it was. Instead of coming down through the Ashaw Valley, they came down over the D. And so that was basically our job, was holding down the DMZ.
I know the answer to some of these questions, but just for the sake of somebody who's listening and doesn't understand Vietnam, but tell me who we're fighting and tell me a little bit about the enemy, their tactics and what type of warfare.
Well, up in the I Corps, which is the DMZ area, we were basically fighting, we were fighting what they called the Gook, but we were fighting more of the hardcore regulars from North Vietnam. Fully trained. They wore a uniform. The Gook was pulled out of a village. He was a sympathizer. You know, he would work with the North Vietnamese. It was just a person from a village. You didn't know who your enemy was at any time. There was no safe area, at least on the DMZ. Up on the DMZ, we did not allow the I'd say, Vietnamese people onto our base camps. You didn't dare because you couldn't trust them. At day, they might be your friend, but at night, they were your enemy. And it didn't matter their age. I mean, we were shooting at kids. Of course, we were young kids at the same time. You didn't know up there who were your enemy at all. You just stayed with your unit and watch everybody in their movements. Hopefully you watched their movements because they would infiltrate and you wouldn't know it. Come down the road 2 or 3 days straight in a row and would not know. And then that was your enemy at night. So that's basically what it was. But up where I was at, it was the hardcore. Mm-hmm. Up there was mostly the North MVA troops. Further down south, mid-country and down below, you were dealing with some of the MVA, but not as much as you were up in the I Corps.
What's the A for? NVA?
Yeah, NVA.
North Vietnamese?
It was North Vietnamese Regular Army.
Okay, Army.
What it was.
Yeah.
They actually wore uniforms. They didn't wear their little silk pajamas and go out at night and that way. I mean, they actually wore a uniform just like what we did.
And just a quick synopsis of Vietnam in general. Did North Vietnam invade South Vietnam? Is that why we got involved in the United States? Is that kind of what happened, you think? Just like in Korea?
Well, we went in because there was a French-Indonesian War, and the French were there before we were. And then the French pulled out, and then we went in there to assist them. And so, at least this is what we were told and what we believed. And it was controlled by the governments, is what it was.
Why did they refer to it as an unpopular war? What's that all about?
Well, when we landed in the States and finally got back, there were protesters right there at the airport. They were calling us baby killers. You know, we were just an individual American soldier, thought we were doing right, joined the service, and told to do a job. You know, the enemy, you don't know how old he is. You don't have a chance to say, wait, stop, how old are you? Are you a kid or are you an adult? Why are you here? Why are you shooting at me? Well, I can't shoot you because you were a child. You know, when somebody points a weapon at you and they're shooting at you, they mean to kill you. So basically, you know, you're out there with the enemy at night. You can't see. Half of the time, or most of the time, you don't even know if you hit someone. You're taking an area and you're spraying it with your ammunition. Hopefully, you know, you aren't going down. Something's not going to hit you, because when you're putting it out, it's coming in. So it's a two-sided story. But we were losing a lot of people in Vietnam, which upset a lot of parents, mothers, friends. And I think the news had a lot to do with things too, in the way they would put the stories across. I would have to say that's just about the situation of, you know, what was happening there, that we would come back and the public was against us, only for something that we were trying to do, and it was our country. And I volunteered for the draft, and I probably would have been drafted, but I volunteered for the Army. I could have probably gone Air Force or Navy. But I felt at that particular time out of high school, I did not know what I wanted to go on into, especially into college. Why waste the money not knowing? So I knew I had an obligation, and that's why I went into service. And I chose the Army. But I also volunteered for the unit to go to Vietnam. I knew it was going to happen, so why fight the issue? I could control it because I at least got to train with my men as a unit prior to getting to Vietnam. Other people were going to Vietnam as a replacement for a lost soldier. And the soldier would go down, they had to replace him with someone. So you came in from the States, went to a repo depot, and then on out to the unit to replace someone else that's gone. And that's the rotation, just basically how it happens. So I don't know how you explain the rest of the people. Right now, there's people down on Vietnam, you know, and we're at the year 2006. It's strange.
Well, you know, again, some of the questions I'm asking you are based on hearsay and things I've heard, so, you know, that's why I think, for the record, a lot of people don't know. Like, when you came home, we hear that you didn't have a very warm welcome, and, you know, they called you stuff. You know, did they throw anything at you? I mean, you know, I know some of the people that I've talked to, they threw stuff at them, and I mean, coming home, have you ever, I guess I can ask this question, has anybody ever thanked you for your service to our country?
It's amazing now, at this particular time in my life, my vehicle has a Purple Heart plate. And because we're in war right now, I could be stopped at a stoplight, and all of a sudden someone's walking across the street. He'll get out of the crosswalk and walk over to my window and want me to roll my window down and thank me and shake my hand, because he's seen that I was in combat because of the Purple Heart plate, and would thank me for what I've done. And we don't feel that we've done anything any more than it was our obligation. That's our country and our flag. And you got to be proud of it. So that's, yeah, it's amazing how it's turning around now. People coming up and saying, thank you for going into the service. But we now don't have the draft either. So thank God we aren't losing the amount of people, though, that we were. That was a completely different fought war.
I'm going to kind of jumping around a little bit here. So as far as your combat experience, you pretty much have shared to me most of what had happened over there as far as combat.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different missions we went out on, but...
Was there a more difficult mission, or maybe the one you just described where you were wounded, or...
Well...
Or what was the hardest part of Vietnam over there for you? What was the most difficult thing for you?
I'd say probably the most difficult thing is at night being out in the boonies, not knowing where the enemy's at. Every move you make, they can hear, but every move they make, you can also hear. You know, and if you're out in a small group, you know, there's always that little question. Are they going to get you, or are you going to get them? So, you know, now it's you, the enemy, and the darkness. And they know that background and we don't. That's their backyard. And I mean, it's one thing to have it in your territory where you know where you're going, but we didn't, you know. I think that was probably the toughest thing, is at night.
You're a sergeant, but did you have friends? I mean, you're not supposed to have friends, right? Are you, as a supervisor or a person in leadership? Get close to your men. I mean,
you try not to get too close to your men, but in my particular case, I was very close to my men, but only because they were getting the 5th Division back together again to send to Vietnam. So we actually put the unit together at Fort Carson, Colorado, and then went out in a complete wave to Vietnam and had to set up everything because we had nothing. They had to set up the company areas, they had to set up food supply, we had to wait and get our tracks to be brought in, our weapons and everything. So we went as a complete unit. And so when you're working with your men like that, day after day, trying to say, okay, this is what we're going to do if we get caught in this situation. And so you become a friend. But, you know, there's a lot of guys that were taken into units in Vietnam that didn't have that type of situation of me work with my men. They didn't want to get real close because you never knew from one day to the next if you're going to lose that man next to you. You know, and it's bad enough to lose one that you don't know, but it's worse if you've been with that person for a long time. And in my particular squad, underneath me at that time, I never did lose a man in Vietnam, but I lost one of the men from my squad when he was sent to another unit. And what we had to do was change people out, take them from our unit and put them into other units because we all came there at the same time. And you don't want that unit to leave at the same time, so by bringing and infiltrating other people from the other units into your units, now you're changing the date of their DEROs of departure. So they won't leave all at the same time and have to be replaced all at one time. So that finally happened, and when this individual from my squad went down to another unit, he ended up on a mission and didn't make it. But with my initial squad, I didn't lose anybody up on the DMZ from my initial squad that was with me.
Can you tell me about the drug usage over there? You hear things that was bad, you know, did it affect the combat? Was it done in the rear? I mean, what can you share a little bit about that? Any insight?
It was probably the worst thing that could happen is the drugs. It was very rich with drugs, the whole country. And my squad, my company, we didn't have a problem with it. But in a lot of other units, they had the problems with it. Fortunately, I got to work with my men. My men knew how I worked, and they knew how I knew how they worked, how I worked. And we had a trust and a bond. So, you know, we would not mess with drugs. We stayed totally away from it. But there was cases where it got infiltrated in areas. We had a rocket attack come in on a base camp one night. One gentleman got hit by a rocket because he was high. And now what he was high on, I'm assuming it was marijuana. But the sirens went off to take cover, and he just sat there watching the fireworks. Well, the fireworks got him, and he was buried. But drugs, because of that reason, my men, we stayed away from it. The enemy used a lot of it also. You'd find the enemy charging a tank, coming up onto a perimeter, your barbed wire, because they were so high. They would just point them in a direction and say, go. And, you know, you can shoot a person when they're high and they don't drop immediately. They just, the adrenaline flow and however the drug works on their body, they just keep coming. And they keep shooting. You know, and when you hit someone, if you do know that you hit that person and he doesn't stop, then it's scary. And that would happen.
Do you think it was just the availability of the drugs versus like World War II, where you had the troops and you don't hear stories like that? Do you think it was just because it was accessible, it was a result of the generation, the culture? And then was there more stress in Vietnam than World War II, you think? I mean, or was it a different kind of stress?
Well, we didn't have a front line, back line. It was all around you, so you didn't know where your enemy was. I think part of it was their culture. They used it. What better than get the enemy involved with it? So, and I think it was at that particular time too, that era, the 60s, 70s, it was becoming a problem in the United States. And so they thought that was the best over there. So naturally people were trying it and some people were getting hooked on it. So I think it could have also been the enemy getting it, the source to you also. You just didn't know.
You think it was an escape from the war? I mean, from what was happening there? Even
being a non-user, I can't really, it would be tough to say that, but knowing people that did, I would say that that's probably part of it, is that it made them feel easier. I don't know.
It's interesting talking about that. You know, what does Vietnam mean to you today, as far as the fact that you were there, we fought the war? I mean, does it have any significance or any part of your life now?
Well, that's a part of your life you'll never forget. I would like to go back to Vietnam. That country was a very rich country. At that particular time of my life, being that young, I could see areas of that country. When you're out in the boonies and come across an area and find a shrine. Well, I'm an art lover to begin with. And to see a Buddha shrine out there, it's gorgeous. Out in the middle of the jungle, you know, and to try to understand the people wasn't easy, but you would want to know a little bit about these people. You wanted to know about your enemy, but the villager, was he the enemy, or was he just a person living there suffering because of this? And because the French were there prior to us, there were people that were born and never had a chance to live outside of war. That they were born and they died because the war was there for such a long time. But I would say that the country was untapped for natural resources in a lot of ways because of that war. And I think it would be interesting to go back and see the country as it is now, see what changes have been made in the country, and see how it's progressed.
Hey, Bob, tell me what you were fighting for in Vietnam.
Well, we were fighting for our country, number one. And we were fighting for our fellow soldiers that we were with. But we were fighting, and what we were told we were fighting for was to keep the communists out of the control of the South Vietnamese. And that was the reason we were there. There was a dividing line, which was the DMZ, and our government had us there to try to keep the people from taking over the South. And basically that's what we were under. But as things progressed, our government was working with their government, and they were dictating to our government what we could and couldn't do. Instead of full control, or I think we could have gone in and totally won that war if they would have left us alone and let us go in and take care of the problem. But they didn't. That's about all I can say about it.
Why do you think a lot of Vietnam vets came home and had problems and still do? Do you think it was, you know, I've referred to the drugs or the stress of the battle, or, I mean, why do you think there's problems today with the Vietnam vets? They didn't get help they needed?
A lot of the Vietnam vets that I know and I've talked to, some of them won't speak to me at first. But when they find out that I've been there, and they know that I've been there, now they trust me. And they'll open up a little bit. But it's not easy for these people to open up. I've found, though, that my self-talking keeps me saner. I can live with things a lot easier, and I can talk about the good and the bad. There was a lot of good times besides bad times in Vietnam. It was not a war that a person was there that he was being shot at every day, 360 days a year. Yeah, it didn't happen. You might go weeks without seeing the enemy or without seeing a shot fired. And then everything could break loose. But losing a fellow soldier, a friend, a brother, a loved one, it hurts. It's just not easy. So, I don't know. I found some, and I try to reach out to some of the vets and say, you need to talk about this. You need to try to talk and stay sane. And I will still, at this time, have some nightmares. I mean, it's going to come around. It's something that you cannot erase. That's a time in your life that will never leave. Why for sure, I don't know. I think drugs had some problems with some of them also. Some still use drugs. I choose not to. When you lose friends that were using some drugs, it's just that much more saying, why? Why use it? Look what happened to this person. I want to keep control of myself. They have outreach centers. I've talked to a person at an outreach center. He was amazed, though, because I can talk about Vietnam. But there are people that go to that outreach center that can't. And that's why they're there. They really need help. So.
Tell me about, I asked one of the gentlemen this earlier this week, but tell me about walking down the street and the sound of helicopters overhead and how that makes you feel, or does that bring anything back? I mean,
you'll have flashbacks. I think the biggest flashback that I have, and I have for years, it depends on the temperature, number one. But if it's a warm day, no breeze blowing, and I smell diesel fuel, it will key a big flashback to Vietnam. But I was in a mechanized unit, so all our vehicles were using diesel, and it just permeates the air. So now if it's a real hot day and I could have a bus go by, and if it's dead calm, real warm, and I smell that diesel fuel, it will bring me back to thinking of Vietnam. And, a helicopter will make you think. You can hear a weapon and know what type of weapon it was. An AK-47 had a distinctive sound. So if you hear anything in the distance, especially a helicopter, you hear the beat of the rotors. It can bring on heard those before. Sounds like a Huey. So, yeah, just about anything like that can key an individual that's been there. That you can't erase those things that happen, and you will get a recall from them. But I'd say that what brings me back the most of a recall is the diesel fuel.
It's kind of like a song that dates you. You hear a song and you think 20 years ago you knew where you were. I mean, it's the same type of thing.
Oh, yeah.
With you, probably more deeper impregnated, but I can hear music in the 60s, early 70s.
The dock of the bay.
Yeah. It's kind of funny about music. I know that over here we probably integrated the music with Vietnam. You see a Vietnam movie, you hear Creedence Clearwater, you hear all this stuff, and it's like Vietnam. When I hear John Fogerty singing "Fortunate Son" or something, or it's just like Vietnam. But I think that was our Hollywood putting that. I don't think that was happening over there. Although maybe music influenced Vietnam or had a bearing on things.
I don't know if it influenced, but we had a lot of people that would listen to tapes back then when we didn't have CDs. But music. If you were in a rear area, we didn't have a bar up where we were, but just in the rear area, we'd sit around and somebody would play a tape. Well, it would bring back, now, listening to that music, it'll bring back good and bad times. Most people try to think of the better times than the bad times. I talk a lot about Vietnam, but like I told my friend, you hear me talk about Vietnam, but how many times do you hear me ever talk about the bad times? I try to talk about the good times. But by talking about the good times, and there were good times. There were very good friends that made it back alive. But that is what helps me stay sane. Instead of sit there and ponder on the situation, oh, I lost this guy or that guy. So, but music, I think, did. It brings back a recall. But I think it brings back a recall for just about anybody. If you were in high school and you had a good time and you listened to a song and you were involved with a good-looking girl at that time and then she broke off with you, then later off in your life you might hear that song and say, well, yeah, I was with Betty Lou or whatever, It would bring that recall back to you. And that can happen with the service also.
Tell me again, at the beginning of the interview you mentioned your homecoming, but maybe just a little bit more in detail where you were. You were in an airport terminal. You guys are coming home. Was there anticipation of a bad welcoming? Just walk me through that again a little bit when you came home.
Well, in Vietnam, it was the Freedom Bird. And when your time came, you had a countdown while you're in Vietnam. Every day that went by, you would count a day off. Count a day off. Pretty soon, somebody, well, I'm this short, and you say, well, okay, you're that short, well, but I'm that short. Well, when you become that short, you really back into a corner because you want to go home alive. And once you get to that Freedom Bird, and that was the plane that was coming to take you home, and it wasn't always a military plane. I ended up taking a regular plane coming back, and we were fully loaded. And came back, stopped off in Japan, and then came into Washington. They wanted to check your shot records, make sure you're all clean, and check them again before you landed. And couldn't get off the plane because they had to come in and spray the air in the plane and check everybody again. And naturally, you're going to have no airport can you just drive into the runway. And so there's going to be a fence. And we had no clue in our particular group whatsoever that there were going to be any protesters at the airport. But once we went to get off the plane and go through customs, that's when we saw the protesters and could hear them screaming. and their signs and everything else like that. But at that particular time, we wanted to get off the plane, kiss the ground, say we're home. Let's overlook that fact about the protesters right now. They weren't where we were at. They didn't know. They had no clue what we did. And what made them mad, we didn't want to find out. That's pretty much what it was. Just get home. And that was the most important thing at that time, because we lifted off the ground, we didn't have somebody shooting at us. But it was upsetting, though, that you could come back here doing what we did for our country, or what we thought was for our country, and for that country, to try to help those people. And then to have the people here treat you the way they did. Fortunately, I had no one in my neighborhood at all ever come down on what I did. No one ever, in fact, they didn't even talk about it. They just said, welcome home. That's about all I can say about the protesters.
Bob, tell me, as a veteran, what does freedom mean to you?
The right to wake up free, to choose the job you want to do. If I wanted to go to school, I can. The goals that you want to reach, you can reach out for them and not be held down. We are a free country, and we have a lot of choices, and we can make them good or we can make them bad. And being in the military and coming out of the military, now I see the flag of the United States, and I'm proud. I'm real proud of that flag. But I can stand up and salute the flag and say, it's mine. I helped fight for that flag. So now there's a lot of pride in that situation. That's about all it is. We are in a free country. You can pick what you want to do. You aren't forced into it.
Tell me about the price for freedom.
It's not cheap. If you want to reach out for it, you got to work for it. You have to give besides take. So I chose to go and put in my time for the military. And I felt that it was right. It was a learning experience. I think highly of the military and the people in the military. And they are my brothers, because now they're going through something that I went through. It's an experience that you have to go in to learn. If you aren't in the military, you'll never know about the military. It's a bonding there that I love, and it doesn't matter who they are. You don't have to have race, color, or creed. It's a bonding, and you hold it dear, and you can share. You can look at someone and not say a word, and you'll feel a bond immediately. And that's a pride. And so the flag brings that pride because you see it. You saluted it. That is our meaning of our country. So, when somebody says, well, we're going to burn that flag, it's going to upset you. So I'd say, yeah, we're in a free country, at least to this point in time. I hope I stay seeing it.
I'm going to ask you to do one more thing, if it's okay with you. I ask all the veterans to do this at the end of my interview, I guess if you watch one of my film, you'd understand why, but could I have you give me a salute into the camera when I tell you to?
Mm-hmm.
That'd be okay, from where you're at? Okay, sir, right into the camera.